At 3:12 p.m. local time, the Southern Caribbean seemed completely unchanged. The water was smooth, the breeze was light, and a faint sun hung over the open sea. For the sailors aboard a U.S. aircraft carrier legally sailing through international waters, it felt like any other routine passage. Orderly, quiet, and predictable. Then the radar display shifted. Inside the Combat Information Center, a surface contact appeared to the southwest. Then another, then three more. 5 separate returns, all with low-profile hulls, all moving with clear intent. No AIS signals. No civilian transponders. The symbols on the screen were crisp, unmistakable, and military. The watch officer leaned in, marked the contacts, identify them. Within moments, the system compared shape, speed, and emissions. The result came back quickly. 5 Venezuelan naval vessels. They were not scattered. They were not simply crossing through. They were moving closer. Their speed climbed from 14 knots to 18, then to 20. On the bridge, the carrier stayed exactly where it was meant to be. Same course, same speed. No sudden turn, no visible reaction, just a massive warship cutting steadily through blue water. It was not indecision. It was control. A bridge-to-bridge transmission was sent over an open channel. Unidentified Venezuelan naval vessels, this is a United States Navy warship operating in international waters. State your intentions. No answer. A second call followed, shorter, firmer, and repeated in Spanish. Still nothing. At 3:18 p.m., the updated closest point of approach appeared automatically. 8 nautical miles and closing. This was not chance. Naval vessels do not slide into position by accident. They move with purpose. They coordinate. Every angle means something. Inside CIC, analysts watch the Venezuelan ships begin to widen their spacing. Slight changes, measured changes. One edged toward the carrier's port bow. 2 more expanded to the flanks. The final pair stayed just far enough back to respond if needed. It was not a full ring around the carrier yet, but it was starting to resemble one. The carrier's posture remained unchanged. No alarms, no shouting, just calm, highly trained precision. Data was logged. Optical systems were tracking. Every radar signal from the approaching ships was recorded, time-stamped, and stored. Above deck, sailors continued their work, unaware of the exact pattern taking shape miles away. That is life aboard a carrier, calm on the surface, intensity underneath. At 3:21 p.m., the range dropped below 6 nautical miles. One Venezuelan vessel angled slightly across the carrier's projected course, close enough to get attention, but not close enough to cross a legal line. A calculated move. The captain did not respond with movement. Another call was transmitted. Venezuelan naval vessels, your current maneuvering is unsafe. Alter course immediately. Again, no reply. For the Venezuelan commanders, this was pressure without direct escalation, a show of presence delivered through steel hulls and narrowing distance. For the carrier, it meant something more. Because while 5 ships could be seen on the surface, many unseen systems were already working behind the scenes. Sensors were comparing signals. Analysts were identifying radar types, power output, and scan patterns. The kind of details only available when another vessel comes too close for too long. And with every mile they closed, they exposed more. At 3:24 p.m., the carrier's air wing was quietly alerted. Not to launch, not yet, only to remain ready. Procedure, not panic. On the radar screen, the 5 Venezuelan ships now formed a shallow arc ahead of the carrier's bow. By this point, their intentions were difficult to misread. They were tightening the space. No one had fired. No direct threats had been spoken. But the situation had shifted from a routine transit to a deliberate challenge. And this was only the start. Because in the next few minutes, the response would not come through louder radio calls or sharper language. It would arrive in a way Venezuela had not anticipated. By 3:27 p.m., the pattern was no longer subtle. The 5 Venezuelan vessels adjusted course again. Small moves, precise moves. To someone untrained, it might have looked like ordinary navigation. Inside the Combat Information Center, it looked like coordination. One ship moved ahead, lining up toward the carrier's projected track. 2 others spread wider to shape the lateral space. The remaining pair reduced speed slightly and stayed astern, not falling away, but carefully managing distance. This was not random, it was organized. The nearest ship crossed inside 4 nautical miles, close enough to be seen on the horizon, close enough for optical systems to make out hull markings, deck activity, and the clear outline of naval weapon mounts. Still, the radio remained silent. The carrier held its course and speed. That mattered. In encounters at sea, the first vessel to change course often signals uncertainty. The first to turn away often gives up control of the moment. Here, the carrier did neither. It stayed steady, forcing every move by the approaching ships to happen in the open, on the record, and without any action from the U.S. side that could be used as justification. Inside CIC, surface warfare officers tracked every contact down to a tenth of a knot. Bearings updated in real time. Closest point of approach calculations flashed across the displays. CPA, 2.9 nautical miles. Time to CPA, 6 minutes. The Venezuelan vessels were no longer just approaching. They were applying pressure. Above deck, nothing visibly dramatic changed. Aircraft remained secured. The flight deck stayed quiet. No sudden launches, no visible escalation. That restraint was deliberate. This message was never meant for cameras. It was meant for commanders following the live feed from miles away. At 3:31 p.m., one Venezuelan vessel moved slightly across the carrier's bow. The maneuver stayed within legal limits, but its intent was unmistakably assertive. It created a clear choice: change course and reduce the pressure, or stay steady and record every detail. The carrier stayed on course. Another radio transmission followed, sharp and professional. Venezuelan naval vessels, you are operating in an unsafe manner. Maintain safe distance and alter course. Once again, there was no response. But something else shifted. Electronic support systems quietly confirmed new activity. No alarms, just verification. The Venezuelan ships had begun actively scanning. Low-power surface search radar. Nothing that crossed a legal line, but everything calibrated carefully to increase pressure without provoking a stronger reaction. A classic gray zone move. For the carrier's crew, this was familiar territory. Encounters like this are not decided by who moves first. They are decided by who remains disciplined the longest, who collects the clearest record, and who manages escalation without surrendering control. At 3:34 p.m., the formation tightened. The 5 ships now traced a shallow semicircle ahead of the carrier, their wakes cutting sharp lines across the water. They were not blocking the route. They were not making contact. They were simply close enough to deliver a message without saying a word. We see you. You are being tested. What happens next? The answer, once again, was nothing obvious, at least not from the surface. Inside CIC, another kind of response was already underway. High-resolution optics fixed on bridges and deck positions. Emissions were sorted and identified. Patterns were checked against known databases. Every extra second those ships remained close made the picture clearer. The irony was hard to miss. By pressing in, the Venezuelan vessels were not making the carrier weaker. They were giving it better intelligence. At 3:37 p.m., flight operations shifted quietly from normal to ready. No alarms, no shipwide announcement. Just crews moving with purpose, preparing options without revealing intent. At this stage, the carrier did not need to put its strength on display. It already possessed it, and the longer those 5 ships stayed close, silent, and coordinated, the more the balance began to change. What looked from the surface like an attempt to close in was becoming something very different. A controlled exposure. The moment was getting close when that truth would be impossible to ignore, because the next move would not come from the bridge. It would come from above. At 3:39 p.m., the carrier made its first visible move. Not a turn, not a burst of speed. Something far more deliberate. Flight operations went green. At the edge of the deck, a Seahawk helicopter rolled forward, its rotors beginning to turn. There was no dramatic announcement, no warning tone. To an untrained eye, it might have seemed routine. Just another aircraft preparing for a standard patrol. It was nothing of the sort. This was the turning point. As the rotors reached full speed, the 5 Venezuelan ships held their positions. Their formation remained intact. Their radios stayed silent. From the surface, they might still have looked in control. From the air, that image was about to change. The Seahawk lifted smoothly and moved low across the water, rising just enough to clear the carrier's bow before banking outward. Its systems came online immediately. Optical sensors, infrared, surface tracking, live video streamed straight back to the Combat Information Center. At 3:41 p.m., the helicopter closed to visual range of the lead Venezuelan ship. Near enough to make out movement on the bridge. Near enough to watch personnel shifting along the rail. Still no aggressive act. Still no communication. The helicopter did not behave aggressively. It did not rush the mast. It did not drop toward the deck. Instead, it held a steady orbit. Calm, controlled, impossible to misread. This was not intimidation. It was presence. Inside CIC, analysts watched the incoming data grow richer by the second. Radar emissions from the Venezuelan vessels were now unmistakable. Scan rates, frequencies, patterns, everything was logged, matched, and preserved. The message was subtle but impossible to miss. You came close. Now you can be seen clearly. At 3:43 p.m., the tone began to shift. One Venezuelan vessel changed speed slightly, another altered heading by only a few degrees. Small corrections, cautious corrections, the kind that suggest a second thought. Pressure can work in both directions. The Seahawk widened its orbit, keeping all 5 ships within sensor range. From above, the geometry of the encounter no longer looked the same. The shallow arc ahead of the carrier no longer felt confident. It no longer felt even. Then came the quietest signal of all. A non-lethal laser designator briefly traced across the bridge windows of the nearest Venezuelan vessel. Not a weapon, not a threat, just a precise and unmistakable message. We have you in view. Every move is being recorded. The helicopter crew sent a short transmission over an open frequency. Calm, professional, controlled. Venezuelan naval vessels, you are maneuvering unsafely in international waters. Alter course and maintain safe distance. The message was repeated in Spanish. This time, there was a reaction. Crew members on one Venezuelan ship stepped back from a mount. Another vessel's wake shortened, an early sign that its speed was dropping. Not a retreat, not yet. But it was no longer a push forward. On the carrier's bridge, nothing shifted. Course unchanged, speed unchanged. The captain studied the surface picture in silence. There was no need to force the moment. This was never about making the other side comply on command. It was about allowing the reality of the situation to become clear. By 3:47 p.m., the Venezuelan formation was beginning to lose its structure. The arc started to open. The trailing ships drifted farther apart. The lead vessel relaxed its sharper angle. For the first time since the contact began, the pressure was no longer coming from 5 ships. It was coming from a single aircraft overhead. Quiet, watching, impossible to ignore. What started as a maneuver on the surface had become an imbalance of information. Every second the helicopter remained overhead, the cost of holding close increased for Venezuela, while the benefit kept fading. The carrier never raised its tone, never changed course, never fired a shot. But the message had become unmistakable. This was no longer a simple face-off. It was a turning point, and the next few minutes would decide whether the encounter ended as a minor incident or became a misstep Venezuela would regret. By 3:49 p.m., the balance had shifted almost completely. The 5 Venezuelan ships were still there, still visible on radar, still near enough to matter. But the atmosphere had changed. The tight coordination that defined their earlier movements was slipping. Their formation no longer behaved like a single, unified force. The numbers made that obvious. One ship slowed from 21 knots to 18. Another eased away from its intercept angle, opening more water on the carrier's starboard side. The 2 trailing ships widened their spacing, drifting just far enough apart to avoid fully committing to whatever came next. None of it was announced. None of it was acknowledged over the radio. But inside the Combat Information Center, every adjustment was recorded as it happened. Bearings, speed, wake length. The picture was unmistakable. This was hesitation. Above them, the Seahawk stayed steady, holding a broad orbit that kept all 5 ships within sensor range. It did not pursue. It did not crowd them. It simply remained in place, calm, visible, and impossible to dismiss. Pressure without hostility. At 3:52 p.m., one Venezuelan vessel made the first unmistakable turn away from the carrier's projected path. Only a few degrees, but enough to break the intercept geometry. It was the first clear concession. The carrier stayed on course. Another radio transmission followed, brief, professional, emotionless. Venezuelan naval vessels, your movements are being recorded. Maintain safe distance and alter course. This time, there was an answer. Faint, controlled, carefully worded. The Venezuelan bridge acknowledged operating near what it called sovereign patrol areas and requested that the U.S. vessel change heading. The response from the carrier came immediately. United States Navy warship conducting lawful transit in international waters. We will maintain course and speed. No debate, no extra language, just a statement of fact. From that point on, the outcome was no longer really in question. By 3:55 p.m., the nearest Venezuelan ship had increased the gap to more than 5 nautical miles. The trailing vessels followed, their wakes stretching out as power settings eased. The arc that had once pressed forward dissolved into loose, non-committal positions. The Seahawk made one final pass. Not low, not aggressive, just enough to confirm posture and capture the last imagery. Then it climbed slightly and remained overhead as the distance continued to widen. On the carrier, flight operations stood down as quietly as they had begun. No announcement, no celebration, just a return to standard readiness. This was not some dramatic withdrawal by Venezuela. It was something quieter and in many ways more revealing. They had reached the edge of how far pressure could go without consequences. Anything beyond that point carried risk, legal risk, political risk, operational risk. And the longer they stayed in that position, the worse that calculation became. By 3:58 p.m., the Venezuelan ships were no longer moving toward the carrier at all. They settled into parallel courses, adding distance minute by minute. The encounter had shifted from confrontation to disengagement. No shots fired, no alarms, no dramatic ending. Just a quiet acceptance of what the situation had become. In gray zone encounters, the decisive moment does not come when weapons are fired. It comes when one side recognizes that pressing forward no longer works in its favor. The carrier did not give chase. It did not provoke. It did not follow. It did not have to. By staying steady and letting discipline speak for itself, it had taken control of the story, the evidence, and the outcome. And as the distance continued to open, one thing became obvious. The encounter was finished, but the signal it sent was only starting to travel. By 4:06 p.m., the surface picture had settled. The 5 Venezuelan ships were still visible on radar, but the distance kept increasing. 7 nautical miles, then 8. Their courses now ran alongside the carrier rather than cutting across it. They were no longer testing its path, no longer pressing into it. Power settings eased. Their wakes stretched into long, even lines. No sudden acceleration, no sharp maneuvering. On the carrier's bridge, nothing marked the transition. No announcement, no visible shift in posture. The ship continued ahead at the same speed it had maintained from the start, its bow moving through calm water as if the previous hour had passed without incident. Inside the Combat Information Center, though, the most important phase was only beginning. Every moment of the encounter had been captured. Radar tracks, optical footage, electronic emissions, time-stamped radio calls, both answered and ignored. The record told the story in full, shaped not by emotion or opinion, but by verifiable facts. 5 ships approached, 5 ships coordinated, 5 ships eventually pulled back. No shots were fired, no boundaries were crossed, no escalation became necessary. That outcome was not luck. It was the product of a doctrine refined over decades, one that views restraint not as weakness, but as leverage. In modern naval encounters, the objective is not to win a firefight. The objective is to manage escalation, preserve legitimacy, and make the other side absorb the weight of every aggressive decision. In this case, that weight kept building. With every mile Venezuela closed, it raised the stakes. By approaching without communication, it added tension. By maneuvering aggressively, it created a record. By remaining close, it exposed systems that never needed to be shown. And when the time came to decide whether to keep pressing or step back, the equation had already changed. Because escalation never unfolds in isolation. It unfolds under observation. The carrier did not pursue as the Venezuelan ships moved away. The Seahawk returned to the deck, its rotors slowed, sensors powered down, flight operations shifted back to normal. Sailors returned to their routines without ceremony. Professional restraint works both ways. For Venezuela, the lesson was clear. Even without direct words, pressure has limits. And once those limits are reached, the side that stays disciplined usually comes out in the stronger position. For the carrier and its crew, this was not a moment for celebration. It was proof. The system held. Procedures worked. The encounter ended without allowing a political signal to become a strategic error. Moments like this rarely dominate the headlines. There is no blast, no warning shot, no dramatic footage, but they matter. Because the most dangerous confrontations at sea today are not full-scale battles. They are tests. Tests of judgment, patience, and control, unfolding in international waters where every move is observed, recorded, and analyzed far beyond the horizon. This encounter in the Southern Caribbean ended the way many such moments do. Quietly, professionally, and without force. But it left behind something more durable than noise. A record and a reminder. At sea, power is not measured by how quickly you close the gap. It is measured by how confidently you hold your line and how clearly you leave the other side with only one real choice: to move away.